And now to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith Lecture Series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we are presenting the theme, Media, News, and Ethics in the Digital Age. Our distinguished guests today are James Fallows and R. Gustav Niebuhr. Jim Fallows, who is well known here at Chautauqua and to all of you, needs no introduction, but for the sake of those who may meet him for the first time on video or audio tape, I will say just a few words. Jim, who is serving as our moderator through this week, is a national correspondent for The Atlantic, co-creator with his wife, Deborah, of The Atlantic's American Futures Project, and through that project in partnership with Marketplace, the Fallows have traveled the country reporting on the people, organizations, and ideas reshaping the country, and have been focusing with great appreciation on our regional neighbor, Erie, Pennsylvania. Hear, hear, for Erie. They have just completed a book based on their travels for publication this year. James Fallows has written for The Atlantic since the late 1970s, living and reporting in the western United States and the Far East. He's currently based in Washington, D.C., and in a few weeks he will relocate to England to initiate a London base for The Atlantic. In addition to working for The Atlantic, Jim spent 2 years as chief White House speechwriter for Jimmy Carter, and 2 years as editor of U.S. News and World Report. He has won the National Magazine Award and the American Book Award, among other recognitions, and a New York Emmy Award for the documentary series Doing Business in China. We're delighted to welcome Jim back today, and we're thrilled that he and Deb are with us all week. Today, Jim will introduce our other distinguished guest and a longtime friend and friend of Chautauqua, Gustav Niebuhr, whose presentation is titled, Some Limited Good News, Religion and the Media. And then they will engage in conversation about Gustav's remarks. You'll be pleased to know that Gustav will be doing a book signing immediately after this lecture on the porch of the Hall of Missions, and that his book will be sold there as well. We're very grateful to the Susan Hurt Hagen Lecture Fund and to Thomas B. Hagen for support of Jim Fallows' presence at Chautauqua this week. We're also grateful to the Elizabeth Elzer Doolittle Endowment Fund for adult programming for providing support for all other Week 8 Interfaith lectures. The Department of Religion is greatly pleased to welcome both Jim Fallows and Gustav Niebuhr to this podium. Please join me in providing a very warm Chautauqua welcome to Jim Fallows.
Thank you very much, Dr. Franklin, for your gracious introduction. Thanks, as I feel sincerely determined to say each day, to you and your colleagues in the Department of Religion, Maureen Rovigno and the rest there, for putting on this Interfaith Lecture Series, to our hosts at the Hall of Missions, Bill and Maggie Brockman, to Tom Hagen and his family for supporting Chautauqua in general and this series in particular, and all of you for coming here. There's one bonus thanks I'm going to give today as we have the third day of this week-long afternoon discussion series, which is that if you've noticed an emerging dramatic and intellectual structure to the series of guests you're seeing here, and the ways in which their perspectives are fitting together and they're complementarily building a way to think about the problems of this era, that is due entirely to the efforts of Dr. Franklin and Maureen Rovigno and others there in putting together this lineup. So please join me in thanking them for wrangling such an excellent group of speakers. I'd also like to thank, of course, Gustav Niebuhr, whom I'm about to introduce, for coming to join us and add this next step in understanding the ongoing theme of this week. You'll be relieved to hear I'm not going to go through all the other lectures that have happened the last day or two and the way they fit into what you're about to hear today, although I'm sure many of you enjoyed hearing the wonderful presentation this morning in the amphitheater by Arzu Gabrielieva. So please give her a hand as well. But I will talk about the build-up in this afternoon's series itself and the way the previous two episodes prepare for what we're going to hear today. You'll recall that the first two speakers we heard from, Michael Gerson on Monday and Peter Beinart yesterday, are people they are writers in the middle of public affairs whose main topics are party politics and international affairs and military issues and great affairs of nations, but their perspectives are very deeply informed, as you heard in their presentations, by their own personal religious belief and affiliation. Michael Gerson from his role as an evangelical Christian, and Peter Beinart from his role as an Orthodox Jew, and the way that both of those perspectives affect the way they write, the way they think about media and faith and governance, and we have heard from them. We're about to hear from Gustav Niebuhr, from one of America's leading and most honored and most respected writers about religion, that over the course of a several-decade career, he has written for the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about other topics, but crucially about religion. He's written books including Beyond Tolerance. He's been a frequent guest on public radio, notably All Things Considered. And recently he's been a professor at Syracuse with the evocative dual appointment in the departments of religion and the famous Syracuse journalism department. So there's nobody better positioned from whom we could hear about the intersection of media, religion, and the civic life about which we've been concerned we're concerned in our lives, but also in the discussions of this week. You'll recall that in all the discussions this week, in whatever the venue, and certainly in our discussions here in the Hall of Philosophy, I'm determined to name a room in my house the Hall of Philosophy at some point and do all my writing from there. Or when I bring my children in for serious talks, it will be in the Hall of Philosophy. We've talked about, for example, the possibility and the obligation of local level engagement and reknitting the civic fabric and reestablishing ethical traditions at a time when national level versions of all those things are in trouble. We've talked here about the increasing, it seems, difficulty of bridging divides among political parties, among faith traditions, among different perspectives of almost anything, different parts of the country, different sizes of cities. We've talked about the role of the media in making these things either easier or harder. And we talked about the role of political leadership. What is the obligation of political leaders at different levels? And political leaders, I should say civic leaders, whether they hold office or just are entrusted and empowered with the ability to command audiences. And fortunately, Gustav Niebuhr has thought about all these issues and their intersection on public life right now, and that's what we're going to hear from him. I'll just say a word or two more. He studied originally at Pomona College near my homeland in Southern California. He then did graduate work at Oxford, though long after I was there, and has applied a combination of a scholarly and repertorial and ethical perspective to the work he's done in our leading publications. So please join me, and I'll wait for just a second. I'm going to ask you in a second to join me in welcoming Gustav Niebuhr. He will speak, then we'll have a discussion between the two of us, and I'll invite questions from all of you. So I give you now Gustav Niebuhr.
Thank you very much, Jim Fallows, and also Dr. Franklin. It is a pleasure to be here. As you've heard, I've been here before. It is great to be back on such a wonderful day in particular. I drove through torrential rainstorms yesterday to get here and was hoping that that weather would not be continued here. It wasn't, so that's all to the good. We deal this week with the broad intersection of religion, the news media, and ethical conduct within those fields. The title of my talk, Some Limited Good News, may seem a bit enigmatic, but I'll do my best to explain what I have in mind. And a chance, I should think, of hearing at least some good news would be attractive, but particularly now, these days. One thing I should just mention, and that is, if I seem to pause at any particular time, it's because I'm thinking very deeply. Actually, Do you believe me? Actually, it is because so much has happened in such a short time over the last few days that I've annotated this almost to death. And there will be places where I may need just to sort of look and make sure that my writing is as I thought it would be. So, the last time I spoke at Chautauqua, I had just completed a book on how the interfaith movement, with an emphasis on citizen-to-citizen dialogue and civic collaboration, had taken hold at a grassroots level in various parts of the United States. Its goals, broadly put, were to educate people about each other, about what they held closest, about what they believed, in an increasingly diverse society. Some of this began before 9/11, but it was accelerated, this work, afterwards, after that catastrophe. Ultimately, speak to almost anyone involved in interreligious dialogue, interreligious collaboration, and they would say, we're here to diffuse fear, we're here to sort of make it easier for all people to live in American society, which struck me as about as noble an object as one could come up with. I had a particular interest in interfaith efforts, and that was how the news media contributed to them. Now, that process was not deliberate, but inevitable. Journalists, at least for a decade preceding 9/11, had found a compelling news subject in how new waves of immigrants were being received in the United States. The starting point for all this trend was 1965, when Congress, together with President Lyndon Johnson, signed into law sweeping new changes in immigration law to make it much easier for people from East Asia and South Asia, people who are ambitious, aspiring, educated people, to come to the United States. At that time, business very much supported that plan. How was this manifest in terms of how the media treated it? Well, I'll give you an example. I noticed once in 1989 that USA Today had put American Muslims on its cover, a feature story about Ramadan, the dawn to dusk fasting that marks the spiritual life of any serious Muslim. But by 1990, the immigration itself it was almost inevitable that it would be picked up and turned into a news story. By then, you had a second generation of immigrants, the children of people who had originally moved here. They were oftentimes, by then, living in the suburb. They were middle class. They were ambitious in terms of passing on their beliefs and their knowledge, that they were building houses of worship and religious schools. Some academics, like Professor Diana Eck at Harvard University, began studying this movement closer, and their work was followed by some journalists, including myself. Interested editors and producers began to put these stories on the front page or at the top of their TV broadcasts. The results could be quite remarkable, as in 1997, when Ted Koppel devoted an entire broadcast of Nightline to one American Muslim's pilgrimage to Mecca, an essential component of the man's Islamic identity. That particular story might not be representative of journalistic interests universally, but it worked as an important story about what was going on in the United States, and why not? If you wait to the fact that the United States, long home to Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, to borrow a famous phrase from Will Herbert, had also been absorbing some 3 million Muslims, 1 million Hindus, 2.5 million Buddhists, 250,000 Sikhs, and tens of thousands of Zoroastrians, among others. Well, you had a news story on your hands, or several news stories. And you also had the opportunity for people in general to learn from what journalists were producing in that case. To cover new religions as a news story in the 1990s played an important role in maintaining the civil peace in our nation on and after 9/11. I'll return to that momentarily. First, let me share a word about covering religion as a news subject, followed by a reflection on the fundamental ethics of journalism. I was hired to write about religion as an essential shaping feature of American culture back in 1986. Throughout, I found the subject immensely compelling, unnatural if one were curious about America and its values. And by the way, I emphatically do not mean that I thought all Americans were religious, or, just as wrong, that they were religious in a particular way, a mistake people can often make. I've got to say, though, that my enthusiasm, while very intense for this particular work, was not shared by all. A good many people simply didn't get it. Why would anyone ambitious want to write about religion? Isn't that a dead-end subject? I encountered that again and again. Well, it's dead-end depending on how you look at it. Almost anything can be that way if you don't take it very seriously and if you lack an imagination. That's not exactly what I said to them, though. But a few years back, I got a phone call from an obviously intelligent television producer who told me she and her fellows wanted to add religion to the list of subjects they included in their news programming. But, she said, how do you do it? How can you cover a subject that has the capacity to make people so angry? Well, I said, yes, you're dealing with differing truth claims, but there is a way that you can go at this. One thing is you've got to treat religion as both ordinary within American culture and yet unique. I recall that she thanked me. Alas, we did not speak again. So that's as far as that went. But I would have gone on if I could have and said to her, look, you cover people and organizations all over this country that have real holds on people. You cover certainly Democrats and Republicans. You cover the NRA. You cover the Sierra Club, probably. You can report about them. Why can't you report about people who claim some religious faith? And that was something that I did try to at least point out to others. Her concern, though, was real, and as such, I think can be found illustrated by some dialogue that I've picked up from Henry Fielding's novel, The Story of Tom Jones. I don't know if anyone's read that here. If you like English literature, yes, that's good. Yeah. Well, Tom Jones, or Henry Fielding, has a character named Mr. Thwackum that appears in the novel. Mr. Thwackum is an Anglican priest who has no difficulty explaining precisely the spiritual life, or where one should be in the spiritual life. He says, when I say religion, he tells an acquaintance, I mean the Christian religion. And not only the Christian religion, but the Protestant religion. And not just the Protestant religion, but the Church of England. You know, one's glad we got that straightened out right there. If I had heard that at the time, I think I might have referred my producer who called to something else, and that was to some words of William James, the great philosopher at Harvard a century ago, who spent so much time studying religion. In 1902, he wrote, quote, most books on the philosophy of religion try to begin with a precise definition of what its essence consists of. I shall not be pedantic enough to enumerate any of them to you. Meanwhile, the very fact that there's so many and so different from one another is enough to prove that the word religion cannot stand for any single principle or essence, but is rather a collective name. James was brilliant. That in itself, I think, is helpful to think of in terms of how one can approach the whole broad, diverse subject. But there is one more way, too, and that is in a much more recently, Justice Anthony Kennedy, in deciding a case that involved Santeria, sort of an obscure but important religion in the United States, wrote that religious belief need not be acceptable, logical, consistent, or comprehensible to others in order to merit First Amendment protection. Now, that's certainly something that James Madison would have been happy to hear. He rested easy in his grave when that case came down in 1989. As I said, I got the impression increasingly when covering the interfaith movement that it was valued for its educational effect, that people could learn from each other. When people got together, when people visited each other in their houses or places of worship, when people had a meal together, they were able to ask questions, very basic and ordinary questions that could diffuse concern, could diffuse hostility, could diffuse that lack of knowledge that so often can be translated into fear and worry, concern, all those sorts of things which corrode society. They had some knowledge to begin with which to work, and that is what they saw reflected, as I say, in the media, either beforehand or after 9/11. There were some extraordinary events that occurred at that time. One of them was people who were non-Muslims in several parts of the United States on the day of 9/11 would spontaneously went out and locked hands around mosques and Islamic schools to protect them because they feared that there would be interference with Muslims coming and going. There were invitations by clergy to get together, and in 2002 in New Brunswick, New Jersey, which is very close to where I lived at the time, not far from New York, an evangelical Episcopalian, which is how he described himself, called all the clergy of the town together and also all the officials too, and said we've got to do what we can to protect people who are religious minorities in this town. Those are things like that were inspired. They inspired people, they inspired others who were interested in preserving civil society in a very straitened time. One of the people that he brought in this case in New Brunswick, was the chief of police. And on 9/11, he told the chief, he said, look, what we've got to do right now is if you could get some cruisers down to the local mosque. And what he meant, he told me, was not in any way to try to stop people going in and out, but to protect the Muslims who are worshiping there. To his credit, the chief of police said, I've already got it covered. We've got people down there now. He wasn't letting any time go to waste. People, media, there's more. That police chief, it matters what our leaders do. I think if you are curious very much, I may be saying the obvious here, but here goes. If you go into YouTube, you can call up a short piece of film which shows what happened on the 14th of September in 2001. It's George W. Bush, the president, going to visit Washington's largest mosque on Connecticut Avenue to pronounce Islam to be within the family of nations. Now, you just have to that may seem obvious to many people, but here's the President of the United States going to a mosque on its day of prayer to talk about the benefits of Islam and its importance as a great resource, and a spiritual resource for its followers. Terrorists, Mr. Bush said, violate the fundamental tenets of the Muslim faith. Americans should know that. So he's talking about education there. People in the US and worldwide find peace and solace in Islam. Muslims are doctors, lawyers, members of the military, and they must be treated with respect. He kept using that word, respect, again and again. He spoke eloquently about women who wore hijab and who were, because of that, afraid to go outdoors, afraid they might in some way be attacked by people who thought that they were somehow responsible for the attacks of 9/11. But Mr. Bush at that time said, essentially, that they needed comfort and support, and that if you could go out in their stead, you'd be doing a great lasting favor, not just to them, but to the United States. And he drew a distinction between the United States and what was not the United States. It's quite moving. I've shown it many times to my students, and people do take it with a certain amount of, well, it takes your breath away in a way to think that could be done. The ethical code that underlies American journalism, as it's been practiced over the last century, is not difficult to understand. It begins and ends with accuracy, uplifts clarity, and proceeds with a disinterest, not an uninterest, but a disinterest, conducive to gathering as much information as can reasonably be got. It's a profession that trusts its audience to make a final judgment, A perfect system? No, not at all. Having been steeped in it, though, I'm ready to argue for it as a vital component of a democracy. For my own professional experiences, I brought with me a commitment to tell my students at the Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University that accuracy can be best achieved if they cultivate a discipline of listening. Never, I tell them, be afraid to question people closely. Make sure you understand what they mean. Never hesitate to ask the same question twice or even 3 times. In other words, get people right, so that when you write or broadcast stories, you portray these individuals as they are. Be attentive to what they say. Be alive to the nuance in their actions. And now to a sort of a sad part here, but inevitable. That kind of work works best when you're not confronting somebody with your story, when you're not coming up against someone who really does not like what you do and is going to make it plain. That is, however, part of journalism, and withstanding the antagonism that one can run across is simply the way it is, and one has to get used to it or get out. But it does make the task at hand more difficult. Here, I speak as an American citizen, which I consider to be an extremely distinguished and important role, and one in which you can speak to the world from your experience and from the hopes and aspirations of your nation. I've spent a great deal of time with the news, as you can imagine, during the last week. And it's enough to say we live in distressing and humorless times. I do not like to be made fearful, but in recent days I have been. Strange it is the experience of feeling cast back in time to October 1962. I'm just old enough to remember that month primarily because of the intense quiet that descended on my house as my father sat speechless before our old black and white television set, watching broadcast after broadcast as reporters brought us news of the Cuban Missile Crisis. To those of you with a memory for nation-shaking events, you may also recall that that very month of October of 1962, President Kennedy sent federal troops to desegregate the University of Mississippi. For 2 days, violence enveloped an educational institution, Ole Miss, leaving 2 people dead, one of them a journalist. I cannot guess whether any of this crossed his mind last week when Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, speaking to a gaggle of reporters on his plane home from the Philippines, said that despite the scorching verbal blasts between the United States and North Korea, we, as Americans, quote, should sleep well at night, close quote. His phrasing may have been inelegant, but the avuncular Tillotson meant to be reassuring. And in so doing, he recalled the spirit of a great promise made by Franklin Roosevelt on the cusp of America's entry into the great struggle against Nazism. Speaking to Congress, Roosevelt described the 4 freedoms, the commitment to which separated civilization from barbarism, he said. Roosevelt set aside freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and finally, number 4, freedom from fear, which, he said, means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world, close quote. Not long thereafter, the popular painter Norman Rockwell created a quartet of paintings illustrating Roosevelt's declarative points. Given his direct style and his focus on the American middle class, it's not surprising that Rockwell would imagine freedom from fear as 2 parents tucking their small children into bed. What stands out from this cultural distance is what the father figure holds as he tucks his kids into bed. And that is tucked under his arm is a newspaper, upon which the contemporary viewer can just discern 2 bold headlined words, bombings and horror. Rockwell's newspaper is presented as iconic and necessary. His painting tells us that this is the vehicle through which a responsible person gets his or her information, one which that person can act, upon which that person can act sensibly in the world. It's not true of newspapers anymore. They're just one of many media, but oftentimes they're in that segment of media from which one can derive truth, or as close to it as you can get about the world. There are many of those. As I said, knowledge can grow out of tragedy. I'm a great believer in the value of education to break down barriers and establish a basis for understanding where little existed before. In August 2012, an armed individual with ties to extreme right-wing groups entered a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. He opened fire, he killed 6 people. What was important, going back to that illustration I had earlier about President Bush, is that in this case too, leaders showed up. Governor Scott Walker came, politicians from as far away as India came. Michelle Obama came on a visit. The list went on. If people have ever been curious about what Sikhs do, how they worship before, there was so much in the media, there was a great chance to learn about it. And one of the things one would learn is that just as the man came into the temple, the Sikhs in that temple were preparing to serve langar, which is a fundamental part of Sikh life. It's a meal to which people are invited, and it is open to all because it is vegetarian, totally vegetarian. People sit on the floor to consume it, men and women mixed in that way, so that everybody's an equal. It's a powerful thing, and a powerful statement to have been made in contradiction to the horror that these people faced. I was thinking, how would one follow something like that up? The 5th anniversary was mentioned recently. It's been 5 years this month since that terrible incident in Oak Creek. And just when I was wondering that, I heard on National Public Radio one of the hosts say, what we're going to do in our next story is we're going to talk with the son of one of the victims, as well as a former white supremacist. They've been working together after the shooting to promote peace and nonviolence. One never knows, as I say, where the interfaith story will go and what surprising turns it can take and surprising opportunities for education and for the kind of work that really can take people's breath away. Let me close on a more somber note, I'm sad to say. There's some things, particularly this week, that do worry me. And they're, in particular, the description of the media as the enemy. I think we know really what the enemy is. At least I've heard it said to me by others whose judgment I trust. The media, the enemy is ignorance. I don't think one has to qualify that when one says that. I'm not talking about any particular individual. I'm just talking in general. One thing I might add, and I allow myself to do this, having left the day-to-day news media and now teach at Syracuse University, is I've been able to expand my range a little bit, and that includes being able at times to quote people who are friends, quote people too, who might even be related to me. Never could do that when I was working as a day-to-day journalist. But I'd like to leave you with something that's much more profound and much better written than I could have done. It comes from my great-uncle Reinhold Niebuhr. Nothing that is worth doing can be completed in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing true or beautiful makes any complete sense in any context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we must be saved by love. Thank you all.
Thank you. You can take this microphone to your, if you can pull that out and take it to your chair. It's a test of strength.
Yes, and I think I'm going to pass it.
So we are all grateful to have heard from Team Niebuhr in this wonderful presentation through the generations and through your perspectives. Thank you so much, Gustav, and your great uncle. Before getting into some of the weightier civic and religious issues raised by Gustav's talk, I wanted to mention one point of craft about journalism, since indeed the media is one of our subjects for this week, because there was something you mentioned just in passing, which is deceptively important about the role of reporters. You said how important it was to not be embarrassed to ask a question a second or a third time, to not be ashamed to say, I don't understand, make this clear to me. Most of you in this, I'm assuming most of you in this hall are not actual reporters for your daily work. Many of you may have been at some point, but probably it's not what most of you do for your livelihood. Most of you are probably experts and authorities. You probably are bosses. You're probably used to transactions in which you know more than the person who is coming to talk to you, and you're in the position of authority. One of the great psychological leaps that's necessary to be a reporter is to be comfortable always knowing less than the person you're talking to, and being in this position of intellectual humility, of saying, I don't understand this, explain it to me. So I appreciate that. That's a really important thing. And do you teach your students at Syracuse that?
Yeah, very much so. I think that speaking from the student point of view, there's often a certain amount of embarrassment in wishing one knew everything. But then if you were in that position and you went to call on someone for an interview, it would just be sort of a little bit of back and forth and be over. But what I do tell students, and what is true well beyond student ranks, is that journalism is a tremendous opportunity for learning. You're always on the learning curve, which is a wonderful thing. And I think that's unfortunately not well understood outside of journalist ranks, but it could be shared.
Yesterday morning, I went to see the staff of the Chautauqua Daily, which is as you know, one of the great institutions in American letters these days. I love the Daily, and I told them that they should, if they were lucky enough to have a life in reporting and journalism, they should recognize it's by far the most interesting thing you can possibly do with one human lifetime, because you have many lifetimes experience within one span of years. So pass that on to your students too.
I certainly will.
Okay. So now, onto the substance. Like you, I was very struck by two of the great moments in George W. Bush's rhetorical career. And I say that as not an overall admirer of George W. Bush, but I think in the weeks after the 9/11 attacks, on September 14th, as you said, he went to the National Mosque and expressed that American Muslims were part of the American family. And then on September 20th, he gave a very powerful speech to the Congress about the need for resolution, for confidence, for going forward as one people without being fearful. And as you trace the course of this respect for Islam, and they were all one American family, from a very conservative Republican president 3 days after the 9/11 attacks, to rhetoric now of division and the enemy, etc. Is this all just the happenstance of one person who happens now to hold the office, or what is the course of presidential attitudes on this religious inclusiveness and respect theme? How did we get here?
How did we get to where we are now? Well, I think one of the things that's happened is it's come up quickly, and with a force or a power that I certainly didn't expect. I mean, when you think back to George Bush, he was anything but anti-immigrant. He was pro-immigrant. He's a man who'd grown up in Texas. He knew people who employed immigrants, legal and otherwise. And the same could be said of Ronald Reagan. But something has happened in the last few years that has somehow, it's as if many people in the United States are looking for an enemy, and it's a sour period in American life. I wish I could say more at this point on that particular issue, but it's come up quickly.
Well, I'll pursue that for a moment. I'm going to call now on your expertise as your repertorial hat, and the fact that you've been covering for so long this interfaith movement around the country. For the last couple of years, as you heard from Dr. Franklin, my wife Deb and I have been traveling around seeing the way all of these tensions over immigration and economic dislocation, all the rest, have affected local communities from Erie to San Bernardino to Fresno to Mississippi. And our main conclusion has been the stark contrast between the national level discourse of fear, resentment, seething discontent, etc., and the fact that in most communities, people felt as if they were able to work together and were able to absorb people from other parts of the country and able to think of new economic futures and all the rest. And I'm wondering, is there something, what is your version of that when it comes to interfaith activities? At a time when national rhetoric is more fearful and divisive than in quite a while, what is the on-the-ground local reality? Do you think that's being replicated city by city, or whether it's a gap like the one I'm describing?
No, I think there's some hopefulness there, because I think that those movements, usually grassroots, locality type movements, they continue. Many of them do. There's one that's very effective in Louisville, Kentucky, that began in the early 1990s and continues. It's sort of an interfaith week with lectures and dance and painting and prayer, and Louisville rolls out the red carpet for that. I think, I'm not sure these things are necessarily going to survive on their own. If there's the cultural pressure in general throughout the United States that grows against immigrants and people who are considered quote-unquote strangers, the greater the danger is to movements that seek some kind of unity.
And so just to extend this current phenomenon one click more, one of the dramas of this moment in our politics, I think, is the tension between the parts of our national life that are, in my view, dark and divisive and fear-engendering, and the rest of the American fabric that is pushing back in different ways, whether it's the judicial system or whether it's local institutions or whether it's faith organizations or all the rest. And in various realms that I know about, I've seen increased local pushback of groups, for example, in cities that have a large refugee population, where the schools and the mayors are making extra care to protect the refugees, et cetera. Are you seeing some analog to that in local interfaith efforts where local churches, mosques, synagogues, et cetera, are saying we have a new duty and a new responsibility?
To counter those efforts, the anti-immigrant efforts?
And just generally the polarization of national politics.
I see some of that in Syracuse, which is at the crossroads of our great state of New York right here. The mayor is very pro-immigrant in terms of she sees that bringing immigrants into the city is simply going to help the economy because these are people often who have skills and they want to work. I think that any sort of attempt to push against those ideas would be countered by there is a large interfaith organization that's existed for years in Syracuse and its suburbs. It would push back. There would be various churches there that would push back, including, most notably, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, which has got a consistent and ongoing approach to the question of immigration, of being, on the one hand, speaking out in terms of the law, on the other hand, erring perhaps on the side of generosity and hospitality.
So that there's been a fascinating continuity that in our first two speeches between our discussions about Michael Gerson talking about the way his evangelical community, which in one way might be the most morally censorious of Donald Trump and others like him, in fact being his strongest electoral base, and people feeling as if their tribal loyalty to being defended in various ways outweighed any what you could think of as normal spiritual concerns, and this was something that Michael himself is wrestling with in his writing. Peter Beiner similarly described a tension within Judaism between the universalizing impulses and what he called the tribalist impulses, and with the more tribalist parts of the conservative Jewish movement, he said, condoning Trump because they thought he was bringing them into the tent of power. How do you see, from your reporter's perspective, this way in which religion is being sort of politically weaponized? Is this any different from what we've had before? Is it more of a problem now? You're the religious reporter expert among us. How should we understand the politicization of religion now?
Well, that kind of politicization goes back, of course, to the late 1970s and the emergence of evangelical Protestants into active political roles. That still is the big story in terms of religion and politics. I think any number of people who write about those subjects were surprised at the support that Donald Trump got from those groups, because he does not, one understands, he doesn't reflect in his own personal life the things that they often evangelicals talk about valuing. On the other hand, I think a key note in all this is that from the very first time that I began covering religion, which included, of course, covering evangelical Protestants, which are about a quarter of the electorate, I ran again and again into this conviction that evangelical Protestants had never been respected by, quote unquote, the establishment. And if one were considered to be part of the establishment, which if you wrote for the New York Times, somehow you got considered to be part of the establishment, that there was always going to be this tension, and somehow that establishment had to be broken down in a way that was conducive then to full religious freedom, which they seem to feel, or many of them that I talked to had been denied them in one way or another. It's a curious thing. I think actually it's within that sector that the most goes on. That is, within that sector of evangelical Protestantism, that the most sort of ferment in terms of relationship between church and state goes on, between how one should be in personal, private life, and how one should behave in the public domain.
I'm going to ask you for a reportorial story or two, which I'll set up this way. As Deb and I have traveled around, we've seen a number of touching / heartbreaking / inspiring episodes on the interfaith front. For example, I don't know if anybody is here from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, but Sioux Falls has been a great center of receiving refugees over the decades, precisely because both its Catholic and its Lutheran charities have worked so hard in assimilating refugees. So in this Great Plains, mainly white city, you have a Sudanese and Darfuris and Congolese, mainly Islamic presence, being protected and welcomed by mainly Catholic or Lutheran people. And we're in the middle of one drama there where a person who was the daughter of a Darfur refugee who was a star student at Sioux Falls High School and was the leader of ROTC there was heartbroken because she couldn't wear the ROTC uniform on Fridays like everybody else because you weren't allowed to do that with a headscarf. And so people there in Sioux Falls, with prodding by Deb, got a ruling from the South Dakota and the National Adjutant General that she could wear, that she could go on ROTC Day with her headscarf and with the uniform as well. And we saw in Dodge City, Kansas, we saw Catholic nuns taking the lead in trying to assimilate largely undocumented immigrants there, and just across the country. And Peter Beinart yesterday was saying he thought that he hoped his faith would take the way. Whenever a mosque was being denied permission to be built someplace, he hoped that the local synagogues would open their sites as places of worship. What are the most interesting or encouraging one or two stories you would give us in that vein of people at the local level working across political, ethnic, religious divides to a better end?
Well, as you were talking there, I couldn't help but think of a story that was 30 years old, and that is the sanctuary movement in the 1980s, in which many Protestant and also Roman Catholic parishes provided actual physical space for people who were fleeing violence in Central America and also fleeing economic lack of opportunity in Mexico to find a place to stay in the United States until they could really really grab hold of opportunity. There was people who were involved in that came under tremendous pressure from the federal government not to allow undocumented immigrants into the country or not to receive them. It pretty much led to a standoff after a while, but this is coming back, and it seems to be coming back under the exact same name, the sanctuary movement, and it's really gotten some people in Congress and also in the administration in a great uproar. It's when you go again, but the problem is here, that is that when you are the authorities, you're the sort of the law, it's very hard to go up against churches and synagogues, no matter how small they are, no matter how, the external weakness of their presence. It's just, you're going up against people who see themselves as being on a mission that they can cite scripture in one way or about, and it just can't. I guess the other thing I was going to say was back in the 80s, you had such a push in the Reagan administration to raise funds for the Contras in Nicaragua and also the government in El Salvador, but it was said by a great politician of that time, Tip O'Neill, that the administration would never get around the core of nuns in this country. that you just couldn't do it. It was they weren't armed, but they were going to stop you.
So I have one more question to ask you, and then I'll of course invite people for the tradition of going to microphones on either side of the room. You are probably even more acutely aware than I am, but I'm also pretty aware of it myself, of the anomaly or sort of the difficulty of religion coverage in the mainstream press, in that it tends to be treated as a curiosity. Reporters in general are not spiritual people. You'll be shocked to hear that, but it is true. That's one reason why it was so interesting to have both Michael and Peter, because they are serious reporters who also are seriously religious people. And you were a pioneer in serious coverage of religion at serious newspapers. Is the mainstream, cosmopolitan, secular, cynical press getting better, worse, the same in taking religion seriously, and how would you urge it to do even better?
I think that, here it is. This is the limited good news. Limited. I think that the coverage of religion has improved somewhat, slightly, maybe better than slightly, because it's had to. The world really can't be explained very easily unless you can explain to your audience, your viewers, your readers, about how certain religions work and how they intersect with society. It's not just extreme religion by any means. There's plenty of that out there. But there have been some very good books and some very important articles in prominent and respectable, I think I could say that, media that I think have been helping people to come to grips with what the United States faces, whether internally or externally. As far as this idea of religion or of reporters being very secular people, I came into the whole business thinking that too. And here I am 35 years later, and how would I answer that? And it's actually a trickier question than one might think. And the way that I encountered it was often in the newsroom, where I was identified as the person who covered religion. That's what I was. I was a journalist. To me, I was a journalist who was on this great subject. But I was also seen by some as having this other role, and which I certainly didn't seek. They would come up to me and kind of rub the toe of their foot on the carpet and kind of look around and say to me, "You know, I'm not religious." I'd say, "Oh, I should care, you know." But I listened to them simply because they were religious. They just didn't know it. How did they not know it? It's because they were wrestling with some great question of meaning, I'm serious, or some very difficult thing in their family, which everybody has something. But to them, that wasn't religion, because religion to them was what they got at their bar mitzvah or what they got at confirmation. It was, little colored figures and things like that. And that was religion, something that had no part whatsoever in their lives. When in fact, they were, as I said, some questions would come out, and we'd go upstairs and have a cup of coffee. I just listened to them, So, anyway.
You can be either a psychologist, a rabbi. There's many career paths open to you after this. Yes. So it's time now for your questions. So yes, please, sir. You can lead off.
Yesterday, James, the speaker yesterday, said,
Peter Beinart. Yes.
yeah, he said that, he had no trouble being an Orthodox Jew and being an American, and that, it was easy, it was able to be both, and evangelical or other type of Christians, can lead an Orthodox style of their faith and be Americans, and there's no problem. And he asked, why can't we also have Muslims, come and be able to live the American society, the American thing, and, be good Muslims, at the same time. I think the problem with that is that the Muslim faith, the Quran, is different than all the other faiths that we've absorbed in that it prescribes death. It prescribes the killing of people who are not of their faith.
And the question is...
So the question is, how do we know when we accept a Muslim from this country or that country, whether they're ready to, if they're coming to accept the culture and to be assimilated into our culture and still live a life that will be meaningful to them as a Muslim?
Over to you, Gustav.
Well, with respect, I've met plenty who've done it and still seem to be doing it. I've met many Muslims across the United States. That's what I was paid to do in being a religion reporter, and that was to seek out people of different faiths and just find out good stories. And with Muslims, I certainly, I'm sorry that they're under such suspicion. I think any other group that would really be, just...
Well, I certainly know that to be true, but I wonder about the people that we don't know about, that we can't go and get information in.
So I will stipulate this as a question for later discussion, and so thank you for raising it. Thanks for answering it. Yes, over here.
I personally think that it was the perfect storm that put us in this nightmare, and not a result of any big, huge movements. I just think it was the perfect storm, and I think what's going to get us out of it is the younger generation, the millennials, and Generation X, and I'd love to have both of your comments on that.
After you.
I am by temperament optimistic. My parents, at least my dad, was that way. I studied in college American history. To me, the main theme of American history is the country's always been going to hell. And it's just
This is true.
You name your decade and there's some big disaster. And so far, with the exception of the Civil War, and even perhaps including that, the resilient capacity of the U.S. has just barely exceeded its possibility for disaster. And so I am congenitally predisposed to thinking the U.S. has terrible problems, which it has resources to deal with. Reportorially, a big theme I have seen around the country is people who are ages 22, 28, 32, they don't want to go around moaning all the time. They have their lives ahead of them. They're building new businesses in Erie and building new families in Fresno, and they have new prospects for Mississippi. So I think that in this realm, as many others, people, it is, as is ever the case, the younger people are the future. How about that for a profound Chautauqua thought?
That's great. I wouldn't disagree with any of that. Yes, and change is constant in America too. It's difficult to be pessimistic, I think, in this country. Here, I'm going to be sounding like Mr. Fallows, but I have hopes, and I think that's part of being an American is actually believing that things will be better. You may run into times when you feel very set back, but many people really do, people I've talked to as a reporter, do in fact believe that things will get better. And it's just a question of finding that way to the better. So.
Yes, over here.
Let's see. Am I close enough?
Yes.
I truly appreciated your definition of religion as a collective entity and assets. Well, I never heard of that, but I'm thinking about coming from a faith community, but I'm learning as recent as last fall that U.S. Census says 40% of people declare nothingness. Now,
They declare
Nothingness.
no religion, you're saying 40% of no religion?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So, nothingness doesn't have a collective entity and the assets. So, would you?
So I think that the census shows a large number of people, perhaps 40%, who declare no religious faith or declare nothingness. How does this fit into the sort of collective assets that religion presents, or some version thereof? How to think of the United States with a large number of non-believers?
Well, what's going on in the United States, according to the three major surveys, 50,000 people that have been done in the last 20 years, does show a growing group of people who say that they're none of the above. Now, what does that mean? That is a really good question for sociologists. It's something that's got to be really studied and chewed over, and there've got to be any number of interviews on that. It's hard to know what none, N-O-N-E, actually means. If there are a lot of people who affirm that, who are they and what are they saying? Some of these questions are tougher than you think. Which makes them so interesting, you know? I think that's as far as I can go on
That's
that.
another good, hard, and serious question that we'll all think about further. So, yes.
May I suggest that you ask us? You ask us who are nons exactly what we believe
I think
and all that. And I think that, no, that's just a suggestion, but one question I have, you mentioned something about the cynical, secular, mainstream press and its treatment of religion. Can we say the same, or should we not also address the secular, cynical, mainstream press's treatment of secularists, humanists, and atheists?
Well, one other thing, I've always felt that part of the beat that I covered included secularists and atheists and agnostics, because they deserved as much coverage as people who affirmed various religious traditions. One just had to be specific with people. That's what I was talking about in terms of asking again and again and again. You had to get it right. You don't want to lay down some sort of stereotype or something of that sort. You really have to, you're on a, one thing about reporting is you're always on a journey to sort of to find out what it is that makes up American beliefs and American action. So.
And to add something to that, if I could, what I was trying to suggest is I guess, two reasons for difference in coverage. One is there's no sort of organization of secularists to write about, as there is the Roman Catholic Church or Southern Baptist Conference or whatever. The other is most people in the national mainstream press are of this tribe themselves. And so there's a way in which there's the kind of familiar disdain you can apply to what you think of as your own people. So I think that actually is, that's my honest estimate of where that, if you detect that tone, that's where it would come from.
If I might just add a very quick addition, there are secular humanist organizations. One of them is in Amherst, New York, which is about an hour's drive from here. It was founded by a man named Paul Kurtz, who also created a publishing house called Prometheus. He died a few years ago, but he was a really interesting guy to talk to.
Good, yes, over here, sir.
Good afternoon. As a Muslim born and raised in New Jersey, and is also at the same time a student of a highly ethical tradition, my question to you as, a person of journalism and religion, what happened to us that we now let politics dictate what we think, say, and do versus the universals that you find in ethics and morals?
I've got to apologize for one thing. I have a slight hearing loss in my left ear. Would you give me the essence of that again?
So what happened to us as a people, as Americans, where we let politics dictate what we say, do, and think versus the universals that you find in ethics and morals, regardless of the tradition?
Well, here, let me say this, that you can point out to people that if I understand your question right, that there are within many religious traditions the ethics, the moral teachings that can be found in other traditions as well, that there is a certain, what shall we say, a certain, that's not unity, it's a certain sort of overlap in places. And I think this has been brought out by any number of people. One of the things about writing about religion is you see an enormous amount of stuff that's published, whether by academic sources or by organizations themselves, and it gives you a different perspective. And it gives you a perspective of just where people are intersecting, who's talking to whom, and what people are learning from each other. Do you want to?
Yeah. No, that's a better answer than I could give. So that's again another profound question that we'll think about further. Yes, sir, over here.
Full disclosure, I'm Canadian.
Whoa.
The news you guys give us is really exciting, but it's not great. We've been through this for 8 years. We had an anti-immigrant immigration administration. We discovered that we embrace immigrants and that the people who embrace them most are the ones with religious affiliations. Now, we discovered that we have about 2/3 of the population that is absolutely for immigration. I keep telling them that you are no different. Can you assure me that your next administration will do the same?
So, looking for consolation about
question. I'll just leave it sit there.
the future of American sanity. Will America return to a more enlightened course on immigration and other fronts? You don't have to answer.
You go ahead, and then I've got something that's sort of close to that.
Good, and what we're going to do actually is going to have each of you, if you could each just give your question, and then Gustav will answer your 2 questions and this question too, because we're in our last couple of minutes. So if each of you could just give your question, and then Gustav will deal with all 3 of them. Yes.
In 1980, when the Pope was here, after he was here, I happened to see an article in the Columbia School of Journalism Review by Gary Wills, in which he talked about the coverage of the Pope's visit, and he said there was no frame of reference, there was no context. Now, I'm sure that doesn't apply to your reporting.
I hope not.
But Kathleen Jamison yesterday is all context. And when James asked you about Trump and began with George Bush and moved forward, that's leaning toward context. Do you feel that there is adequate context in the religious reporting today?
So context and reporting,
Context.
hold that thought, and we'll get from Marty our last question. Yes.
I think what's particularly interesting in the religious arena now is people claiming that their rights are being violated by particular laws. And the 2 things I'm thinking about are the Hobby Lobby situation in which people claim that Obamacare forced them to provide contraceptive coverage to their employees when it was against their religious views. A case that's coming to the Supreme Court next year from the bakers and the florists who do not claim their religious rights are violated if they have to bake cakes or serve flowers, to gay couples getting married. And my question is not whether I agree or disagree with them. That gets covered by the press covers that either as a legal issue or as a social issue. It's never covered as a religious question. In fact, the religious aspect of it seems to me to be disparaged by the media when they talk about it. And I'm wondering what you think of that.
Well,
And so to
depends
provide
on-
you
it
context
depends
here,
on-
we have
Oh, that's right, I'm sorry.
2.5 minutes in which you can address this sort of religious and religio and legal issues, context in general, and then the potential for sane self-correction in the American idea.
all right. I was going to...
It's a tough crowd here.
Okay. Context. We always need context. The more, the better. That's the educative part often in a news story. So I am all in favor of context, and I certainly talk to my students about that. In terms of the Hobby Lobby background of the Hobby Lobby story, I did read, because I thought it had to be there, the religious background to Hobby Lobby. You couldn't write, you couldn't really report about Hobby Lobby without identifying it as having certain public religious claims. So one of the things is, I mean this with respect, but usually people like to complain more than they like to sort of applaud what they see in the news media. And that's not to try to put anyone on the defensive at all, but I've asked people sometimes if they ever feel anything other than anger when they think of the media. And if they do, then it doesn't hurt to sort of think about what went right and what you think was good, and then actually pass that on to the people in charge of the media organization, the news organization with which you're dealing. It's the start of a relationship.
So now you're going to give us a sort of valedictory thought on self-correction and the American prospect from your expertise in religion and civic life and journalism.
The American prospect. Bring me up to date on that. I know.
Well, do you think that from what you know about religion, is it going to serve as a corrective force to sort of keep America on keel? That's a version of the question.
Yeah, right. The thing is, one of the things about religion in the United States that I do believe is that there's a tremendous amount of change that goes on, and there are always new opportunities, and new profits arise, new organizations come to be, and new experiments are tried all the time. If you're curious about this, come take my 19th century religion class at SU. But I take that seriously. Nothing really stands in one place, does it? There's always a tremendous element of change. It's to be expected. And someone once said to me that when the Roman Catholic Church gets around to ordaining women as priests, the press release that's put out will begin, as the Roman Catholic Church has always taught.
I think that's a wonderful note on which to end this session. Please join me in thanking Gustav Niebuhr.